The ring wasn't hers. The name wasn't hers either. Both had belonged, in a way, to Isabel, to the version of the future Isabel had planned before she'd gone and made everything impossible. And so when their mother pressed the small pearl and gold band into Wren Calloway's palm on a Thursday morning in October, she didn't say congratulations. She said, "Don't ruin this." Wren was 24. She had spent the better part of those years being the one who didn't ruin things. The one who came home when asked, who sat quietly at dinner parties, who accepted the smaller portion without comment. Isabel had always been the one who ruined things, and she did it so thoroughly and with such style that somehow the family had always found a way to be proud of her anyway. Until now. What Isabel had done, what she had apparently been doing for the better part of 6 months, was conduct a private and rather enthusiastic correspondence with a married barrister in Halifax while formally betrothed to Mr. Julian Ashford of Ashford and Stanton, the most respected name in the county's import business. The letters had surfaced, as letters in these situations always do. Julian Ashford had not yet broken the engagement. That was the peculiar thing. His mother, the formidable Mrs. Constance Ashford, had written to the Calloway household not with withdrawal but with a proposal. The engagement would stand, but not to Isabel. The family had a second daughter. If that daughter was willing and presentable, the arrangement could continue. The Ashfords had business reasons, a merger pending, a contract that required the social appearance of settled respectability. They did not need love. They needed a Calloway wife by December. Their mother had presented this to Wren as an opportunity. For whom? Wren had asked. Her mother hadn't answered that. She met Julian Ashford for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon at his family's house on Elm Crescent, a stone and timber manor that had been in the Ashford family since before Confederation, and knew it. The parlor she was shown into had the particular kind of quiet that comes from money held still over many generations. Heavy drapes, a fire that had clearly been burning since morning, portraits that watched without expression. Julian was standing by the window when she entered. He turned, looked at her, and said, "You're younger than I expected. You're quieter," she said, before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, exactly. More like the door to a room that had been locked for a long time, acknowledging that someone had knocked. He was 31. Darker than Isabel had described. Isabel had called him pleasant-looking in the distant, dismissive way she spoke of everything that didn't excite her. He was taller than pleasant-looking. He had the kind of face that took a moment to resolve itself, that you didn't quite understand until you'd been looking at it longer than was polite. His hands, when he gestured toward the chair across from him, were the hands of someone who actually worked, which surprised her, given everything. "Sit down, Miss Calloway," he said. "There's no reason for this to be worse than it already is." She sat. They talked for an hour. Not about the merger or the contract or what Isabel had done. They talked about, strangely, the weather in November, and whether the elm trees on his property would survive another hard frost, and the particular problem of transporting glassware by rail without breakage. He was, she discovered, someone who thought before he spoke and said less than he meant. She was someone who usually said more than she meant, so they arrived, eventually, at something approximating balance. When she left, his mother was waiting in the hall. Mrs. Constance Ashford was a small woman who wore her authority the way other women wore jewelry, not for decoration but for weight. She looked at Wren for a long moment before she spoke. "You'll do," she said. It wasn't warmth. But Wren had learned not to require warmth from women who held the keys to things. They were married on a Saturday in the second week of December, in the same church where Isabel had once stood in a white dress for the rehearsal, practicing the walk she never took. The flowers were white and green. Wren wore their grandmother's brooch because her mother had asked her to, and her own dress because she'd refused to wear Isabel's. Isabel did not come. She had gone to stay with a cousin in New Brunswick, their mother said, which meant she had gone somewhere to be angry without witnesses. Wren stood at the front of the church beside a man she had met twice and felt, for the first time in her life, like a figure in someone else's story, like she'd walked into the third act of a play whose first 2 acts she hadn't seen, and everyone else in the theater already knew what she was supposed to do. Julian stood beside her with his hands very still and his face the way it had been that first afternoon. Not unreadable, exactly, just held. She noticed, absurdly, that he smelled like cedar and cold air. She noticed that when the minister stumbled over the words, Julian's jaw tightened, not in irritation but in something closer to sympathy. She noticed that when he put the ring on her finger, he looked at her, not at the ring. She didn't know what to do with any of that. The reception was at the Ashford house. There were 40 people. Wren knew 6 of them. She stood near the fire and accepted congratulations from strangers who called her Mrs. Ashford and watched her face to see how she received it. She received it the way she received most things, without showing very much. His business partner, a man named Mr. Seymour, shook her hand for too long and told her twice that Julian needed someone steady. She wasn't sure if he was describing her or asking her to be. His aunt, a Mrs. Thorne from Ottawa, brought her a glass of sherry she hadn't asked for and said, in a lowered voice, that Julian had never looked comfortable at parties before this one. Wren looked across the room to where Julian was standing with two men from his firm. He didn't look comfortable exactly. But he looked over at her twice in the 20 minutes she was watching, and the second time she looked back, and he didn't look away first. That was not nothing. She wasn't sure yet what it was, but it wasn't nothing. The house they moved into had been Julian's alone for 3 years, since his father died, and he'd bought out the estate's other interests, and made it simply his. It was a working house, not a showpiece. Books in the study that had clearly been read, a kitchen that got the morning light, a garden that had gone a little wild because no one had had time for it. Wren liked it more than she'd expected to. The first weeks were careful. They were not unkind to each other, but they were precise. Two people learning the distances required for a house to be shared without friction. He rose early and was often in his study by 7. She was not a morning person, and he did not seem to require her to be. She cooked on the evenings when Mrs. Page, their housekeeper, was away, and he ate everything she made without comment, which she initially took as indifference until the Thursday she burned the carrots and he ate those too. "You don't have to eat them," she said. "They're not that bad," he said. "They're terrible." He considered his fork. "They're a bit terrible," he admitted. And then, very quietly, he smiled. Just at the edge of his mouth, quick and private, like something he hadn't meant to show. She catalogued it, that smile, filed it next to the jaw tightening in the church, next to the twice looking across the room. Evidence of something she didn't yet have a name for. Isabel wrote in January. Not to Wren, to their mother, who forwarded the letter without comment. Isabel had heard, through some cousin of a cousin chain, that the Ashford merger had gone through, that the contracts were signed, that Wren was, apparently, thriving. Isabel found this irritating. The letter made that clear. It also, tucked near the end, contained the sentence, "I only hope Julian understands what he gave up." Wren read that sentence 3 times. Then she folded the letter, put it in the kitchen drawer under the tea towels, and didn't think about it for several days. In February, something shifted. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that feels large in retrospect, when you're trying to identify the moment everything changed. Julian came home late on a Tuesday, later than usual, and instead of going directly to the study as he generally did, he came into the sitting room where Wren was reading and stood in the doorway for a moment. "There's a problem," he said. She put her book down. The problem was this. The Halifax barrister, Isabel's barrister, had surfaced again. Not with Isabel, this time, with a document. A letter that Isabel had apparently written last spring, before the engagement, that suggested she had disclosed certain details of the Ashford business dealings to her correspondent. Details that could be inconvenient. Details that a rival firm was now, somehow, in possession of. Julian sat down across from her. He had the look he got when he was thinking, not shut down but turned inward, processing. "You're not angry," Wren said. It surprised her. "I was angry 3 hours ago," he said. "Now I'm trying to figure out what to do about it, what can be done." "That depends." He looked at her directly. "How much do you know about your sister's correspondence with Garrett Finch?" Wren blinked. "Garrett Finch is his name? You didn't know." "I knew she'd been writing to someone married. I didn't know who." She paused. "Does it matter?" "It might." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a meeting next week. The rival firm wants to renegotiate terms using what they have. I need to know whether they actually have anything, whether the information is real, or whether it's a bluff assembled from rumor. And, you think I could find that out?" He didn't answer immediately. "I think," he said carefully, "that your sister is more likely to tell you the truth than to tell me anything at all." Wren thought about that. She thought about Isabel in New Brunswick, irritated that everything had worked out without her. She thought about the letter under the tea towels. She thought about the way her mother had handed her that ring. Not like a gift but like a task. "If I talk to her," Wren said, "I need you to understand something first." Julian looked at her. "I'm not doing this for the merger. I'm not doing it to protect the contract." She held his gaze. "I'm doing it because if there's a problem in this household, it's my problem too. And I'd like to be told about problems when they happen, not 3 hours later." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. like he'd expected a smaller version of this conversation and gotten the actual one instead. "Understood," he said. "Good." She went to find her coat. She wrote to Isabel that night. Not a long letter. Isabel didn't read long letters, but a precise one. She said she needed to talk. She said she'd come to New Brunswick if necessary. She said, at the end, that she was asking as Wren, not as a Calloway, and not as an Ashford, and that she'd appreciate the same in return. Isabel telephoned 3 days later. She was, characteristically, already on the defensive before she'd finished saying hello. She wanted Wren to know that whatever Julian had told her, it was incomplete. She wanted Wren to understand that she had been in a very difficult position last spring. She wanted it noted that the correspondence with Garrett Finch had been emotional, not strategic, and that she had never meant for any of it to. "Isabel," Wren said. Isabel stopped. "Did you tell him about the Pemberton contract?" Silence. It was the particular silence of someone who had been hoping you wouldn't ask the exact right question, and you had asked it anyway. "He asked," Isabel said, finally. "He was curious, that's all. He said he admired Papa's work with Julian's firm. It was a conversation, not a did you tell him specifics? I might have mentioned." Isabel stopped again. Then smaller, some numbers. Wren closed her eyes. "How specific, the margin, on the Pemberton side?" A pause. "I didn't think it would go anywhere. I thought it was just. I thought he was interested in me, in us, not in the figures." There it was. The whole thing, distilled. Isabel had wanted to be wanted, and she'd reached for the only currency she hadn't checked the weight of first. Wren didn't say any of that. She asked 4 more precise questions, got 4 more small admissions, and ended the call with her sister saying her name in a voice that was half defensive and half something younger than that. Something that sounded, if she was honest, a little frightened. "I'll sort it," Wren said. "But Isabel, you don't get to vanish after this. You don't get to be in New Brunswick while it gets sorted. You understand?" A long pause. "Yes," Isabel said. Quiet. The voice she'd used at 9 years old when she'd broken their father's watch and known she couldn't charm her way out of it. She told Julian that evening, after dinner. All of it. The Pemberton margin, the way it had been given, what Isabel had and hadn't understood about what she was doing. He listened without interrupting. That was something she had learned about him in these months. He was a man who could be still when information was coming in. He didn't scramble to respond. He waited until he had the whole shape of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It's enough," he said. "I can work with that. The rival firm, they'll try to use what they have. They'll try. But if I know what they have and they don't know I know, I can get ahead of it." He looked at her. "That's more than I had this morning. It's not everything. It's just enough. Sometimes that's the same thing." She stood up to clear the tea things and he said without preamble, "Wren." She turned. He was looking at her with that particular expression she'd been cataloging since December. The one that wasn't a smile, but was adjacent to one. The one that appeared to happen against his will. "Thank you," he said. It came out plain and direct, and without the careful wrapping he usually put around words when he wasn't certain of the ground. She didn't say "you're welcome." She thought about it and decided that wasn't the right thing, not quite. What she said was, "We should have talked sooner about how things work here. I'd like to talk about that." He nodded. "So would I." It wasn't a declaration. She wasn't looking for one. But that evening, after the fire had burned low and Julian had spread 3 folders of paperwork across the dining table, in the way he did when a problem had moved from alarming to merely solvable, Wren sat across from him with her own notebook, and they worked in the same room for the first time like 2 people who occupied the same life. Not parallel to each other, but actually alongside. She thought about the ring. About the name. About how both had arrived as someone else's cast-offs, pressed into her palm like a task instead of a gift. They didn't feel that way tonight. She wasn't sure when that had changed, exactly. These things didn't change all at once. They changed the way November light changes, incrementally, day by day, until you look up and realize it's different, and you can't name the morning it turned. Isabel came back in March. Not to the Ashford house. She wouldn't have had the nerve for that, not yet. But to the family home in Berwick, where their mother was. And where Wren drove out to meet her on a Sunday afternoon when the roads were still half mud from the thaw. She was thinner. Isabel, who had always inhabited her own beauty with perfect confidence, looked, for the first time in Wren's memory, uncertain of her edges. She was sitting in the front parlor with a cup of tea she hadn't touched when Wren arrived, and she stood up too quickly, which was how Wren knew she was nervous. "You look well," Isabel said. "You look tired," Wren said. Isabel laughed, a small surprised sound, the laugh she made when something was actually funny, instead of the one she performed for rooms. "I suppose I am." They sat down. Their mother found a reason to be in another part of the house, which was her way of giving them something she wouldn't name. They talked for 2 hours, not easily, not the way sisters talked in books, with everything resolving into warmth and understanding by the 3rd page. They talked the way people talk when there's a real thing between them that hasn't been named yet, circling it and coming closer and then pulling back and then, finally, getting close enough to put a hand on it. Isabel said she hadn't meant for it to go as far as it went. With Garrett Finch, Wren believed her, mostly. She also said she hadn't thought about how it would land on everyone else, and that was harder to forgive, and Wren told her so. You left me to clean it up, Wren said. Not with anger, just with accuracy. And I didn't even get asked, I got handed a ring. Isabel's jaw tightened. I know, you should know. A pause. How is he? Wren thought about Julian with his folders spread across the dining table, the problem already reclassified as solvable. She thought about the burned carrots, about a bit terrible, about the way he looked when he actually smiled, which was rare enough that she'd started to notice every time. Honest, she said. He's honest. Isabel looked at her with an expression Wren couldn't quite parse, something between wistfulness and relief, she thought, as though she'd needed permission to believe that things had worked out, and that was the closest thing to it she was going to get. I'm glad, Isabel said. And Wren thought she meant it. In April, the rival firm came to the table. Julian had prepared for 12 days. Wren had sat with him through 4 evenings of that preparation, asking the questions no one else in the room thought to ask, because she'd come at the problem from a different angle, from the angle of someone who knew what information Garrett Finch actually had, how he'd gotten it, what he understood, and what he'd misunderstood, because Isabel herself hadn't entirely understood it when she'd said it. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Wren was not there for it. It wasn't her room to be in, but she was in Julian's study when he came home, and she knew from the way he came through the door that it had gone well. He set his briefcase down and stood in the middle of the room and said, They backed down. They had less than they thought. She looked up from her book. What will they do now? Regroup. Find another angle. But not this one. He sat down in the chair across from her. Not behind the desk, not at the proper remove, but in the reading chair, which was closer. You were right about the Pemberton figures. They'd inflated them in the telling. By the time Finch had them, they'd drifted enough that they didn't match our actual documentation. Isabel overestimates margins when she's trying to impress someone, Wren said. She always has. Julian looked at her. You knew that. I grew up with her. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I keep thinking about what you said in February, about wanting to be told about problems when they happen. She set her book down fully. I've been thinking about it too, he said. I've been running this business alone for 3 years. I've gotten used to problems being mine to carry. He paused. I don't think that works anymore. She waited. I'm not very good at this part, he said, with the directness he used when he was being honest about something he found difficult. The sharing of it. I know, she said. But I'd like to be. It wasn't a declaration. Neither of them dealt in declarations. It was something more useful. An honest statement of intent from a man who meant what he said, and said considerably less than he meant, which meant that when he did say something, it had weight. She thought about December. The church. The ring that hadn't been hers. The name she'd stepped into like a coat that didn't fit. She thought about the way the house had felt foreign for weeks, and then had slowly, room by room, started to feel like hers, like theirs. I'd like that too, she said. He nodded. Then he opened his briefcase and took out the files he'd brought home to review, and she picked up her book, and they sat in the study in the particular quiet that is not emptiness but fullness. 2 people who had arrived at the same place from different directions, who had found, without quite meaning to, that it was easier to be there together than to be anywhere alone. Outside, the April light was still coming through the window at 6 o'clock, which meant winter was finally losing its argument with the season. The elm trees, which Julian had worried would not survive the frost, had survived the frost. The garden was still a little wild, but she'd started working on the near corner last weekend, and he'd come out without being asked and held the stake while she drove it into the ground, and neither of them had said anything about it because there was nothing to say. It was just the shape of things now. The ring was hers. The name was hers. And she wore both, finally, as though they had always been.